It was a crisp Monday morning and the city buzzed with its usual energy. A young man, neatly dressed in a sharp suit that spoke volumes about his professionalism, walked into one of the most prestigious banks in town. He had been preparing for this day for weeks, going over numbers, perfecting presentations, and ensuring every document was in order. This meeting wasn't just another business appointment, it was a chance to take his dream to the next level. The bank's grand glass doors opened automatically as he stepped inside. The lobby was impressive, with marble floors gleaming under soft lighting, plush chairs arranged neatly, and a massive chandelier hanging from the ceiling. It felt like stepping into a world where success was almost tangible. But there was something else in the air too, something hard to put a finger on but impossible to ignore. He approached the reception desk where a woman sat typing away on her computer. She glanced up briefly, her eyes scanning him from head to toe before returning to her screen without saying a word. For a moment, he thought maybe she hadn't heard him. So, he cleared his throat politely and said, "Good morning. I have an appointment with Ms. Hargrove at 10 o'clock. The receptionist paused mid-typewriter click and gave him a quick nod. "Take a seat," she muttered flatly, pointing toward the waiting area without making eye contact. Her tone wasn't exactly rude, but it lacked warmth, a stark contrast to how she greeted the white couple who walked in moments later. To them, she smiled warmly, asking if they needed help right away. They were ushered to a nearby office almost immediately. He brushed it off, telling himself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe she was just having a bad day. After all, this was a big bank, and people probably came in constantly needing assistance. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Sitting down in the waiting area, he checked his watch. It was 9:50 a.m., plenty of time before the meeting. He pulled out his folder, reviewing the documents once more to make sure everything was perfect. Every now and then he looked up, watching other clients being called in ahead of him. Some were older gentlemen in expensive suits, others younger professionals clutching briefcases. Each time someone new entered the lobby, they seemed to get priority over him. By 10:30 a.m., frustration started creeping in. He had come prepared, ready to discuss his plans for expanding his business, a venture that had already gained traction and shown promise. Yet here he was, still waiting while everyone else moved forward. He decided to approach the receptionist again. "Excuse me," he said calmly, leaning slightly over the counter. "I've been waiting since 10 o'clock for my meeting with Ms. Hargrove. Could you please check on her availability?" Without looking up from her screen, the receptionist replied, "She's tied up at the moment, please sit tight." Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they carried an undertone of dismissal. Tied up? Really? He glanced around the room, noticing how no one else seemed to be experiencing delays. People came, got attended to, and left, all except him. Time ticked by slowly. By 11 a.m., his initial optimism began to waver. He tried to stay composed, reminding himself why he was here. This loan wasn't just about money. It represented years of hard work, sleepless nights, and sacrifices. He couldn't let anything or anyone stand in the way of his goals, but the longer he waited, the harder it became to ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. Was this really happening? Had he done something wrong? No, he reminded himself, firmly. He had followed protocol, arrived early, and brought everything required. There was no reason for this treatment. As the clock struck 11:30 a.m., anger simmered beneath the surface. Not loud or explosive, but quiet and steady, the kind that comes from knowing deep down that what's happening isn't fair. And yet he stayed seated, gripping the armrests of his chair tightly, determined to see this through. Because giving up wasn't an option. Little did he know fate had other plans. Something, or rather someone, was about to walk through those glass doors and change everything. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. The man in the suit tried to distract himself by scrolling through his phone, flipping through the documents in his folder, and occasionally glancing at the clock on the wall. But, no matter what he did, the frustration simmered just below the surface. He couldn't help but notice how everyone else seemed to be moving ahead while he remained stuck in limbo. A young woman with a toddler in tow walked in, looking slightly frazzled. Within moments, she was greeted by a bank employee who offered her a warm smile and guided her to a private office. An elderly gentleman shuffled in next, leaning on a cane. He barely had time to settle into a chair before someone appeared to assist him. Every new arrival seemed to get immediate attention, everyone except him. By now it was well past 11:30 a.m., and the waiting area had thinned out. Only a few people remained scattered around the room, most of them already engaged in conversations with staff members. He sat there gripping his folder tightly, trying to keep his emotions in check. Deep down, though, the unfairness of the situation gnawed at him. He thought back to all the times he'd heard stories like this, not just in banks but in restaurants, stores, airports. Stories where people who looked like him were treated differently, often dismissed or ignored. He had always hoped those were isolated incidents, anomalies in an otherwise fair system. But sitting here now, surrounded by luxury and professionalism, he couldn't deny the truth staring him in the face. His stomach churned as he replayed the morning's events in his mind. He had arrived early, dressed appropriately, brought all the necessary paperwork. Everything about his appearance screamed responsibility and success. Yet none of that seemed to matter. It wasn't just the weight, it was the way he was being treated, or rather not treated. At one point, a junior employee passed by his seat, glancing at him briefly before walking away without saying a word. That small act felt like a punch to the gut. Was he invisible? Did they think he didn't belong here? These questions swirled in his head, making it harder to stay calm. Finally, unable to take it anymore, he stood up and approached the reception desk again. This time he made sure his voice carried just enough authority to demand attention. "Excuse me," he said firmly, leaning closer so she couldn't ignore him. "I've been waiting for nearly 2 hours now. Can you please tell me when I'll be able to meet with Ms. Hargrove?" The receptionist looked up, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. "As I mentioned earlier, she's still busy," she replied curtly, her tone dripping with impatience. "You'll need to wait your turn." "Wait, my turn?" he echoed, incredulous. "I had an appointment scheduled for 10 o'clock. Everyone else has been seen promptly, but I'm still sitting here. How is this acceptable?" Her expression hardened, and for a split second he thought she might argue back. Instead, she turned her attention back to her computer screen, effectively dismissing him. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to step away before things escalated. Arguing wouldn't solve anything, and losing his temper would only give them more ammunition to stereotype him. Still, the injustice burned inside him like a slow fire. Back in his seat, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. Should he leave? Walk out and never look back? No, that wasn't an option. This loan meant too much, not just for him, but for the team of people counting on him to deliver. Giving up now would mean letting them down, and that was something he refused to do. As he wrestled with these thoughts, the door to the manager's office opened, and a tall, well-dressed woman emerged. She glanced around the lobby, her eyes scanning the remaining clients. For a brief moment their eyes met, and he thought maybe, just maybe, she was finally coming to see him. But then she turned away, heading toward a different section of the bank entirely. The disappointment hit him like a wave. He clenched his fists, digging his nails into his palms to steady himself. What was he supposed to do? Keep waiting indefinitely? Demand answers from someone higher up? The uncertainty weighed heavily on him, pressing down on his shoulders until it felt almost unbearable. And then, just as he was contemplating storming out, something unexpected happened. The bank's glass doors swung open, and a group of sharply dressed individuals walked in. They exuded confidence, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floor as they moved with purpose. One of them, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, paused mid-step, his gaze landing directly on the man in the suit. Recognition flickered across his face. "Hey, isn't that—" he muttered under his breath, turning to the person beside him. In that instant, everything changed. The man in the suit froze as he realized one of the newcomers was staring directly at him. His heart skipped a beat. He didn't recognize the face immediately, but there was something familiar about the way the man's eyes widened with surprise and then narrowed with concern. It was clear that this wasn't just another random customer walking into the bank. The group moved closer, their presence commanding attention. The air in the room shifted instantly. Everyone, from the receptionist to the junior staff milling around, seemed to straighten up, suddenly alert and on edge. These weren't ordinary visitors. They carried themselves like people who mattered, like people used to being listened to. And now all eyes were on the man still sitting in the waiting area. The man with salt and pepper hair stepped forward, his expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice loud enough to draw even more attention. Caught off guard, the man in the suit hesitated for a moment before responding. I have an appointment," he said slowly, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "An appointment? For what?" the older man pressed, clearly not satisfied with the vague answer. Before he could explain further, another member of the group chimed in, a woman with sharp features and an air of authority. "Wait a minute," she said, her tone sharp. "Isn't this the same person we've been hearing so much about? The one running that innovative logistics project?" Now it clicked. This man with the salt and pepper hair wasn't just any passerby. He was someone important, someone connected to the very business. The man in the suit had been fighting so hard to grow. In fact, if memory served him right, this individual might even be one of the key investors keeping tabs on emerging startups. The realization hit everyone in the room almost simultaneously, including the bank staff. The receptionist, who had barely acknowledged him earlier, suddenly looked panicked. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard as though she wanted to type out an explanation but couldn't find the words. Even the manager, Ms. Hargrove, emerged from her office at the commotion, her composed demeanor visibly shaken when she saw the group standing near the waiting area. Well, the salt and pepper-haired man continued, crossing his arms over his chest. "This is interesting. You've been waiting here since 10 o'clock and no one thought to let you know your meeting was delayed? Is that correct?" The man in the suit nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. On one hand, it felt good to finally have someone acknowledge what he'd been going through. On the other hand, having this kind of confrontation play out in front of everyone made him uncomfortable. He didn't want drama. He just wanted respect. Ms. Hargrove hurried over, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floor. She forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker," she said, addressing the man with salt and pepper hair. "Is there something I can assist you with?" Mr. Whitaker raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Actually, yes. Perhaps you can explain why this gentleman has been sitting here for nearly 2 hours without anyone bothering to see him, according to my understanding, he had a scheduled appointment with you." Ms. Hargrove's face flushed red, her composure cracking under the weight of the accusation. "Oh, I'm so sorry about that," she stammered, glancing nervously between Mr. Whitaker and the man in the suit. "There must have been some sort of misunderstanding. We've been incredibly busy today." "Busy?" Mr. Whitaker interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "So busy that you couldn't spare 5 minutes to greet someone whose work you claim to support? Do you even know who he is? Or does his appearance dictate how seriously you take him?" The room fell silent. Every employee within earshot stopped what they were doing, exchanging nervous glances. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. For the first time since arriving at the bank, the man in the suit felt seen, not as a stereotype or an inconvenience, but as a human being deserving of respect. Yet, he also felt conflicted. Part of him wanted to step back and let Mr. Whitaker handle the situation, while another part wanted to speak up and share his side of the story. "I appreciate your concern," he finally said, breaking the silence. "But honestly, I came here today hoping to focus on my business. Instead, I've spent 2 hours wondering if I did something wrong, or if it's just because of how I look." His words hung in the air, raw and honest. No one dared to interrupt. Even Ms. Hargrove seemed too stunned to respond. Mr. Whitaker placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "You deserve better than this," he said firmly. Turning to Ms. Hargrove, he added, "And you need to do better. If this bank wants to maintain its reputation, incidents like this cannot happen again." The gravity of the moment settled over everyone in the room. For the man in the suit, it was both empowering and exhausting. Empowering because he finally had allies willing to stand up for him. Exhausting because it shouldn't have taken a high-profile visitor to bring attention to something so fundamentally wrong. As the confrontation unfolded, whispers rippled through the lobby. Clients whispered to each other, some nodding sympathetically, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Meanwhile, the bank staff exchanged uneasy looks, fully aware that this incident would likely have repercussions far beyond the walls of the building. And yet, amidst all the chaos, one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Every word that had been spoken hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and unignorable. Ms. Hargrove stood frozen, her face flushed with embarrassment, searching desperately for a way to explain herself, without digging the hole any deeper. But no matter what she said, it was clear that damage had already been done. "Let me assure you, Mr. Whitaker," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "This is not how we operate. There must have been some sort of miscommunication." "Miscommunication?" Mr. Whitaker cut her off sharply, his tone leaving no room for excuses. "Do you really expect us to believe that? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like something else entirely." He gestured toward the man in the suit, who remained quiet but visibly tense. "This isn't just about being late or forgetting an appointment. This is about treating someone with basic decency, something your team seems to have overlooked today. And frankly, it's unacceptable." Ms. Hargrove opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, realizing there was no good answer. Instead, she turned her attention to the man in the suit, attempting to salvage what little dignity she had left. "Sir, please accept my sincerest apologies. If I had known you were waiting this long, I would have addressed it immediately." Her apology sounded hollow even to her own ears. The man in the suit didn't react right away. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Was he angry? Disappointed? Or maybe both? Whatever he was feeling, he wasn't ready to let her off the hook so easily. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I understand mistakes happen," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "But when those mistakes only seem to affect certain people, it raises questions. Questions about fairness, respect, and whether everyone is truly treated equally here." His statement landed like a punch to the gut, hitting not just Ms. Hargrove but everyone within earshot. A few employees shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Others exchanged guilty glances, knowing full well that what he was saying rang true, not just for him, but for countless others who might have walked out of this bank feeling invisible. "Mr. Whitaker nodded approvingly, stepping closer to Ms. Hargrove. "You see, this isn't just about one bad day or one missed appointment," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "It's about accountability. People trust banks like yours to handle their finances, their futures. But if they can't trust you to treat them with respect, why should they trust you at all?" Ms. Hargrove looked as though she'd been backed into a corner with no escape route. She tried once more to defend herself, her voice cracking under the pressure. "I assure you, this isn't reflective of our values as an institution. We pride ourselves on professionalism and inclusivity." Before she could finish, another member of the group, a younger woman with a no-nonsense attitude, spoke up. "Then prove it," she said bluntly, crossing her arms over her chest. "Actions speak louder than words, Ms. Hargrove. Saying you value inclusivity means nothing if your actions say otherwise." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words sinking in. Even the clients lingering in the lobby stopped pretending to mind their own business and turned their attention to the unfolding drama. Some nodded in agreement while others whispered among themselves, sharing stories of similar experiences they'd had, or heard about, at this very bank. For the man in the suit, this moment felt surreal. Hours earlier, he had walked into the bank hoping for a straightforward meeting. Now he found himself at the center of a public reckoning, with powerful figures demanding answers and accountability. It wasn't the kind of spotlight he'd ever wanted, but it was impossible to deny the significance of what was happening. As the confrontation continued, Ms. Hargrove grew increasingly flustered. She glanced around the room, looking for support from her staff, but found none. Her authority, once unshakable, now crumbled under the scrutiny of the board members and the growing discomfort of those watching. I'll make sure this never happens again, she promised weakly, addressing both the man in the suit and the group. We'll review our processes, provide additional training, whatever it takes. Her promises sounded rehearsed, like lines from a script she'd memorized for moments like this. But the group wasn't satisfied. They weren't here to hear empty platitudes, they wanted real change. Mr. Whitaker leaned in, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. Good. Because we'll be keeping a close eye on this. And if anything like this happens again, rest assured, it won't just be a private conversation. Trust me, you don't want that kind of attention. With that, he turned back to the man in the suit, his demeanor softening. Are you okay to proceed with your meeting now? He asked gently, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. The man hesitated, weighing his options. Part of him wanted to walk away, to leave this place and never look back. But another part knew that walking away wouldn't solve anything. This wasn't just about him, it was about setting an example, showing that unfair treatment couldn't go unchecked. I'll stay, he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. But I hope this serves as a wake-up call for everyone. His words echoed through the room, leaving a lasting impression on everyone present. For the first time that day, he felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this incident could lead to meaningful change, not just for him, but for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation. As the group moved toward the manager's office, the atmosphere in the bank shifted. The once opulent lobby now felt tense and somber, a stark contrast to the polished image the institution tried so hard to project. Employees scurried around nervously, whispering among themselves about what would happen next. Clients lingered, awkwardly, unsure whether to stay or leave. And through it all, the man in the suit sat quietly, steeling himself for the meeting ahead. He knew the road wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that sometimes progress came from standing your ground, even when the odds felt stacked against you. The meeting with Ms. Hargrove finally began, but the air in her office was anything but normal. Gone was the polished confidence she usually carried. Instead, she sat stiffly behind her desk, fidgeting with a pen as though it might offer some kind of lifeline. Across from her, the man in the suit took his seat, flanked by Mr. Whitaker and the rest of the group who had decided to stay for the discussion. Their presence wasn't just supportive, it was intentional. They wanted to ensure that this wasn't going to be brushed under the rug as soon as they left the room. Ms. Hargrove started awkwardly, trying to regain control of the situation. First, let me reiterate how deeply sorry I am for what happened earlier, she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It's clear there was a breakdown in communication, and I assure you, steps will be taken to prevent this from happening again. Her words felt rehearsed, like a script designed to smooth over any conflict without addressing the real issue. The man in the suit listened quietly, his expression unreadable. He wasn't interested in empty apologies or vague promises. What he wanted, what he deserved, was accountability. Mr. Whitaker leaned forward, his sharp gaze locking onto Ms. Hargrove. Let's skip the formalities, he said bluntly. We all know this isn't about miscommunication. It's about bias. And if we're being honest, this is far from an isolated incident. This bank has a reputation, Ms. Hargrove, one that doesn't exactly scream inclusivity. Ms. Hargrove opened her mouth to protest, but Mr. Whitaker held up a hand, silencing her before she could speak. Don't bother denying it. We've heard the stories, seen the patterns. People come here expecting fairness, only to walk away, feeling dismissed because of their race, gender, or background. That's not just bad customer service, it's damaging to your brand, and to the community you claim to serve. The weight of his words hung heavy in the room. For a moment, no one spoke. Ms. Hargrove looked down at her desk, avoiding eye contact, while the man in the suit sat silently, letting the truth sink in. He didn't need to say anything. The facts spoke for themselves. Finally, the younger woman from the group chimed in, her tone firm but measured. "This isn't just about him," she said, gesturing toward the man in the suit. "It's about every person who walks through those doors hoping to be treated with dignity and respect. If your team can't figure out how to do that, then maybe it's time for a serious overhaul. Not just in policies, but in mindset." Ms. Hargrove nodded slowly, clearly realizing she was outmatched. "You're absolutely right," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "And I promise, changes will be made. Starting today, I'll personally oversee mandatory training for my staff on diversity and inclusion. We'll also implement stricter protocols to ensure appointments are honored promptly, regardless of who's waiting." Her promises sounded better this time, more genuine. But the group wasn't about to take her word for it. Mr. Whitaker crossed his arms, his expression unyielding. "Good, but actions matter more than words. So here's what's going to happen. We're setting up an oversight committee to monitor progress. You'll report directly to them and they'll have full access to review your operations. If improvements aren't visible within the next 3 months, trust me, heads will roll, including yours." The threat wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. Everyone in the room understood the stakes. Ms. Hargrove swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Understood," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll cooperate fully." With that, the conversation shifted back to the original purpose of the meeting, the loan application. Despite everything that had transpired, the man in the suit remained focused. He laid out his proposal clearly and professionally, outlining the potential growth opportunities his business offered. His confidence hadn't wavered even after the morning's ordeal. If anything, it seemed stronger, fueled by the knowledge that he'd stood his ground. Ms. Hargrove listened intently, jotting down notes and asking thoughtful questions. For the first time that day, she appeared genuinely engaged, perhaps motivated by the scrutiny she was now under. By the end of the presentation, she gave her approval, promising to expedite the process so funds could be disbursed as soon as possible. When the meeting concluded, the group stepped outside the office, leaving the man in the suit alone with Ms. Hargrove for a final moment. She hesitated before speaking, her voice softer now. "I truly am sorry for how you were treated today," she said sincerely. "And thank you for bringing this to light. It's long overdue." He nodded, accepting her apology but making it clear that forgiveness wouldn't come easily. "Apologies are a start," he replied evenly, "but real change takes work. Don't let this be forgotten once the spotlight fades." By late afternoon, news of the incident had spread throughout the bank. Employees whispered nervously in hallways, speculating about what would happen next. Some expressed guilt, admitting they'd witnessed similar situations but never spoken up. Others defended themselves, claiming they weren't directly involved. Regardless of where they stood, one thing was certain: the status quo had been shaken. Word reached senior leadership, including the CEO, who issued a public statement later that evening. "Today, we fell short of our values," the statement read. "We acknowledge the concerns raised and are committed to taking immediate action to address these issues. Our customers deserve better, and we will work tirelessly to rebuild trust." While the response was appreciated by many, skepticism lingered. Promises were easy to make, but delivering on them was another story entirely. Still, the man in the suit found solace in knowing that his experience had sparked a larger conversation, one that couldn't be ignored. As he left the bank that evening, he felt a mix of emotions. Relief, exhaustion, pride, and frustration swirled inside him. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he also knew he'd made an impact. Sometimes standing up for yourself wasn't just about personal victory. It was about paving the way for others to follow. And as he walked out into the fading sunlight, he resolved to keep pushing forward, because progress, no matter how slow, was worth fighting for. The days following the incident at the bank felt like a whirlwind. News of what had happened spread quickly, not just within the building but across the community. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a wake-up call for institutions that claimed to value diversity but often fell short in practice. Social media buzzed with reactions, some supportive, others critical, but all agreeing that the moment was significant. For the man in the suit, life didn't return to normal right away. Instead, he found himself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. People reached out to him, wanting to hear his side of the story. Friends praised him for handling the situation with grace and dignity, while strangers thanked him for speaking up about something many had experienced, but few dared to challenge publicly. It was overwhelming, but also empowering. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment reflecting on everything that had happened, his phone buzzed with a notification. A local journalist had written an article titled, "Standing Up When Silence Feels Easier." The piece highlighted how one person's courage could spark change, not just for themselves, but for countless others facing similar struggles. Reading. Those words made him pause. He hadn't set out to be a symbol of resilience or advocacy. He'd simply wanted to secure a loan for his business. Yet here he was, standing at the center of a much larger conversation. The next morning, he decided to lean into the role fate had handed him. He started by reaching out to organizations focused on combating systemic bias in workplaces and financial institutions. Together, they brainstormed ways to turn this isolated incident into a broader movement. One idea stood out: creating workshops aimed at educating businesses on recognizing unconscious biases and fostering inclusive environments. These workshops wouldn't just focus on theory. They'd include real-life stories from people who had faced discrimination, offering tangible examples of where things went wrong and how they could improve. As word of these efforts spread, invitations began pouring in. Community centers, schools, and even other banks asked him to share his experience. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't exactly his forte, and reliving the humiliation of that day wasn't easy. But each time he stepped onto a stage or sat down for an interview, he reminded himself why he was doing this. Every story shared, every lesson learned, brought them one step closer to a world where no one would have to endure what he did. During one such event, a panel discussion hosted by a local nonprofit, he met others who had faced similar challenges. There was a young woman who had been passed over for promotions despite consistently outperforming her peers. An elderly man recounted how he'd been denied service at a restaurant because of his accent. And a college student spoke about being profiled by security guards while shopping at a high-end store. Hearing their stories reinforced the importance of amplifying voices that were often ignored. After the panel, several attendees approached him, thanking him for shining a light on issues they thought no one cared about. "You gave us hope," one woman said, her eyes glistening with tears. "Hope that we don't have to accept this kind of treatment anymore." Those words stayed with him long after the event ended. They reminded him that while individual actions mattered, collective effort was what truly drove change. So, he continued, pushing forward, partnering with advocacy groups and using his growing platform to speak out against injustice wherever he saw it. Meanwhile, the bank took its own steps toward accountability. True to their word, senior leadership implemented mandatory diversity training programs and formed an oversight committee to ensure compliance. Employees participated in workshops designed to help them recognize and address biases. While some grumbled about the extra work, many admitted they found the sessions eye-opening. Slowly but surely, small signs of progress emerged. Clients reported feeling more respected during interactions, and internal surveys showed improved morale among staff members. But the man in the suit knew better than to celebrate too soon. Change wasn't linear. It came in fits and starts, often requiring constant vigilance. That's why he kept a close watch on the bank's efforts, occasionally checking in with Mr. Whitaker and the Oversight Committee to ensure promises were being kept. If anything slipped through the cracks, he intended to call it out immediately. In the end, though, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Despite the bank approving his loan application, he chose to partner with a minority-owned financial institution instead. It wasn't about punishing the bank. It was about aligning himself with values he believed in. Supporting businesses that prioritized inclusivity felt like a powerful statement, one that echoed far beyond his personal circumstances. Looking back months later, he realized how much he'd grown since that fateful morning. What began as a frustrating encounter had transformed into a catalyst for change, not just for him, but for everyone paying attention. He learned that standing up for yourself wasn't just about seeking justice in the moment. It was about creating ripple effects that inspired others to do the same. And so, as he stood on yet another stage addressing a crowd eager to hear his story, he ended with a simple message. Don't underestimate the power of your voice. Even when it feels like no one is listening, speak up anyway, because somewhere someone is waiting for the courage to follow. With that, the audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the room like a promise that together they could build a future where fairness wasn't the exception, but the rule.